All right, we have a quorum present. Today is August 28th, 2019. This special called work session here in Board and Commission Room. It is 3:04. This is to discuss the Land Development Code revisions. We're going to go ahead and recognize you. I think what we're going to do is try to get through the entire presentation, hold questions until the end. That way we make a video record. If somebody wants to just get on there and see what the presentation was, they have the opportunity to do that. And then we'll ask questions at the end of this. I turn it over to you. Again, I just want to say thanks. The purpose of these meetings is to try to daylight some of the stuff that you're doing in response to the direction that the council gave to staff earlier this spring. But just so that people in the community can see what you're working on and how you're translating that direction into your work. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, council members. Anique Baudet. I'm co-lead on the project on the Land Development Code revision. And I'm here today. We have our consultant, Peter Park, co-presenting with us today, as well as Lacey Peterson and Greg Dutton from the Planning and Zoning Department. So we're just going to jump right into it. We like to always start with our project schedule that was released or late July, and with a stop here at the special called work session today on the 28th. I will note that we have also added and confirmed another special called work session to work through and socialize the work that we're doing in response to Council's direction on May 2nd. That will be again September 11th. And then we will also be able to brief you all on progress at your regular called work session on September 17th. And the Planning Commission is scheduled to have their public hearing October 26th, moving into November with Council's public hearing potentially in early November, and then moving towards first reading in December. So again, an overview of the schedule. As we finish the presentation, I will bring this slide up again to go over some pertinent next steps related to the month of October. October is going to be a very busy month with regard to public participation. And so I will bring this slide up again at the end of the presentation and talk through details there for you all and also for the public. So our agenda for today is really three topics. We're going to start with our methodology and approach in service to your direction on the approach to transition areas, including compatibility. We're going to talk a bit about our approach to downtown and how we're treating downtown, and then also parking. So with that, I'm going to hand over the transition discussion to start with Peter Park.
Good afternoon, Peter Park. I'm a consultant working with the staff. Happy to be with you this afternoon. So, oops, sorry. I didn't realize you already advanced the slide. Thank you. So we're going to start with the transition areas, and we want to clarify several things about transition areas, our working definition of the transition areas, and sort of the use of terms, because sometimes people say transition zones, sometimes we say transition areas. We're trying to be very clear that with a transition area, we mean where the missing middle zones would be applied, right? To provide the transition from the corridor to the residential neighborhoods. And so as in previous presentations, our slide format is to start with the council direction and speak to how the current code deals with these. How draft 3 addressed it, some potential revisions, and the most important thing, what is the effect of the change? So council directed to map new missing middle housing in transition areas adjacent to activity centers, activity corridors, or transit priority network. So under the current code, as you all know, you don't have transition areas, you don't have zones that we describe as missing middle zones necessarily. And so, therefore, the current code doesn't really provide sufficient opportunity for missing middle housing, as has been discussed a lot in the past. And also, under the current code, there aren't affordability bonus in most neighborhoods, right? I mean, that mechanism as a way of leveraging more affordability does not exist in most neighborhoods. In Draft 3 introduced missing middle zones with the affordable housing bonus, and missing middle zones were applied. In Draft 3, they were only applied where current zones would allow multi-unit development, right? Or where they were recommended in neighborhood plans. Okay? So that's how Draft 3 dealt with introducing missing middle zones to Austin. And under the potential revisions, what the staff has been working with is applying the missing middle zones per the council direction in transition areas based on what we're describing as a data-driven and a context-sensitive approach. And we'll describe that in a second. So that the overall effect would be to increase missing middle housing capacity near corridors, which is everyone's priority, and that the missing middle housing would provide those transitions from fronting corridors to lower density residential areas. And this would then in turn support your 50-50 mode share goal to make your transit objectives more effective. So there are two aspects of transition areas that we want to really clarify. Let's say the transition areas, we describe it as a cumulative approach. Cumulative approach based on the council direction, right? So the council direction was to that the LDC should map properties for missing middle housing in transition areas that meet some or all of the following criteria. Entitlements and length of transition areas should be relatively more or less intense for areas that meet more or fewer of the criteria listed below. So number one, located on a transit priority network or Imagine Austin Center or corridor. Two, located within the urban core as defined by the residential design and compatibility standards. Three, has a well-connected street grid. And four, located in high opportunity areas as defined in the Enterprise Opportunity 360 Index. So it was really the cumulative, right, incidence of these criteria that the staff have been using to determine go 2 lots deep or 5 lots deep. So the more of the criteria present, the more that the transition zone would be mapped toward 5 lots deep. And so to illustrate this, here's sort of a sample configuration of typical urban condition where along the corridor, the fronting parcels are indicated in the red, and the lower density residential areas would be indicated in the yellow. So you never knew that counting to 5 could be kind of complicated, right? You know, the thing is in Austin, you have a lot of varied patterns, right? So this is why we want to make really clear what the methodology is for how to count to 5, right? So you can see here, per the council direction, the fronting parcel in red on the left side on the corridor, and then counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parcels back defines sort of this depth of where the transition area is, where the missing middle zones would be applied, right? In the case where, for example, all four criteria are present, right? That's how staff has understood when to map 5 deep. And so, for example, here, what you see is the mapping of the fronting zone on the corridor. The first 2 lot depths are mapped the more intensive missing middle zone, and the next 3 would be mapped the less intensive missing middle zone, which then would create the transition from the more intensive corridor front to the lower residential densities, right? Okay, and this is sort of the typical methodology in terms of how to count to 5, right? In cases where the criteria are not as present, this is how you count to 2, right? Which is really going back 2 lots from the corridor And again, the missing middle zone that allows more intensity would be number 1. The missing middle zone that allows less intensity of missing middle housing is 2, and then it goes to the single-family residential zone. Okay. So that's sort of the cumulative approach. So the depth, the 2 to 5, is a function of how many criteria are present. And that, as a mapping tool, is actually something that can be done in GIS, right? These criteria are mappable. And so I'm not going to say it's automatic by any means, but it is mappable using the tool GIS. So that's one way to sort of do the first stage of work. The next stage is a contextual approach. The council direction was the length and level of entitlement transition areas should be substantially reduced in vulnerable areas identified in the UT gentrification study, regardless of the number of criteria met above. And the city manager shall also use the following conditions as appropriate when mapping transition areas: orientation of blocks relative to corridors, residential blocks sited by Main Street or mixed-use type zone lots, bounded by other zones, use, or environmental features, including topography, drainage, and flooding considerations, and whether it's most appropriate to split zone or not split zone a lot. I can say with regard to the last one, in general, the practice that's being followed is not creating split zoning. You don't need to do that anymore if you're going to have transition zones, right? So, so that's just not part of the approach. But what is important is to recognize that when we're talking about a contextual approach, this is a little bit more of a, I guess the best way to describe it is kind of a handcrafted way of making the map, of really understanding what are the contextual conditions as you get down to making decisions and applying some judgment with regard to some of these considerations. So, under the current code, some existing situations. Under the current code, you have single-family zones often directly adjacent to the commercial corridor, right? There's this direct adjacency and proximity. And another situation that you have today is when you're trying to provide missing middle opportunities, because you don't have the zones and because the maps aren't really zoned that way, it generally requires a rezoning, and then it's a by-lot, sort of a reactive process rather than a proactive approach to actually providing opportunities for more diverse housing in the form of missing middle. So in Draft 3 didn't include transition areas because we didn't have the direction that we do now. And also, it didn't have the benefit of the recent in-depth gentrification data and studies, such as the UT gentrification study. So the approach that the staff are using now is mapping transition areas based on context, and we'll describe a little bit about what that's about, and also reducing the length and the level of transition in areas susceptible to displacement guided by the uprooted study. So the effect is a much more fine-tuned application of transition zones based on context, and the potential of increasing missing middle housing where context supports transitions. So going back to our context here, in this case, here's those 5. So this is when, in the case when we're hitting on all 4 cylinders and we have all the criteria, this would be what 5 lots deep would look like. In the case where we don't meet all of the 4, it gets dialed back to 2. In the cases of, so in the case of areas vulnerable to displacement, for example, it definitely gets dialed back to 2 in terms of the length or the depth of the transition area. And also, and the color will change here, the less intensive missing middle zones would be used to be mapped there, right? To map those transition zones both less deep and with the less intensive missing middle zone, right? And so what we're really talking about here then is in counting the 5 lots and developing the methodology for counting 5 lots, this is defining kind of the transition area or the depth of the transition area. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lacey, and she's going to explain a little bit more about what some of these things mean.
Good afternoon, Council. Lacey Patterson with Planning and Zoning. Yes, thank you, Peter, for that explanation. So now we get to the fun stuff. So as Peter said, this is kind of the transition or missing middle zones defining the transition area. We use this transition area because blocks are often perpendicular or have different orientations off the corridor. And we don't always see this a parallel grid system. So these transition area depths are applied to properties for consistency. With this process, the amount of lots included in the transition area does vary. In most cases, though, the depth of the ranges of the transition area is could be from 500 to 700 feet, but never extends over 850 feet from the fronting property, the front of the corridor. Moving forward. So there are many instances where the corridor lots are deep, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. In these places, the transition area does not extend further. So in other words, the lot count does not restart, and the transition area depth remains consistent. Connectivity to the corridor is also a factor. Though the lots are adjacent to and sited by the deep corridor lots in this example on the right of the slide, and they're within the transition area, they're not, so they are adjacent to the corridor property and sited by the deep corridor lot, but they are not connected to the corridor. And so they do not have a missing middle zone applied. There is those properties that are sited there in the middle of that large corridor lot. They will continue to trigger compatibility, which Peter will get back to in a second. Some additional context, there are areas that have environmental constraints, such as this example where there's a floodplain and properties are encumbered with different building standards. Transition areas and missing middle zones or new missing middle zones are not applied to these areas. So the depth of the transition area is not the limiting factor, but it's the presence of an environmental constraint. I'll go ahead and give it back to Peter so we can talk about compatibility.
Yeah. So Lacey mentioned on this slide, in this case, on the right side, right, showing that transition area. So you see there's a cul-de-sac of residential. Those would trigger compatibility, right? Because a missing middle zones weren't applied, right? The transition area is not established. So in this case, those adjacencies, the residential would in fact trigger compatibility on this larger commercial site, okay? And that's really the primary situation where compatibility would be triggered, right? So with regard to compatibility, Council provided direction that lots adjacent to parcels fronting an activity corridor will be mapped with a zone that does not trigger compatibility, and that could provide a step down in scale from the zone of the parcel fronting on activity corridor. The next bullet says the same thing. The revised zoning map should include a transition area that will eliminate the impact of compatibility for parcels along all activity corridors and within activity centers. Lots adjacent to parcels fronting on activity corridor will not trigger compatibility, will be in scale with any adjacent residential house scale zone, which again is what the missing middle zones would do with regard to the compatibility. And then in general, consider revisions that minimize the impact of compatibility standards on properties facing transportation corridors, particularly in relation to shallow lots. So under the current code, and this had been discussed a lot in previous discussions, the current code compatibility method is rather unpredictable and inconsistent because it's based on a use. And so if there's for example, a single-family use, even if that use is in a multifamily zone, right, that use will trigger suppression on the corridor. So there are two aspects about it. There's a kind of complexity and inconsistency about that. It's also a very long reach of suppression of 540 feet. And so what happens then is that the current compatibility standards on the current code restricts height and unit yield quite often, specifically on the corridor where you're trying to grow more opportunities. In Draft 3, compatibility was based on zone adjacency only, and the length of compatibility of the compatibility area was also reduced. So this was moving a little bit closer to what is typical practice in these kind of compatibility standards. And the majority of corridors were still affected by compatibility, and again became very, very significant when you had a shallow lot, right, in terms of the reduction of development on the corridor. So with the council direction, the staff is mapping new transition areas with the missing middle zones that don't trigger compatibility on each other, or they don't trigger compatibility on the fronting parcels on the corridor. And so the effect here, the result is you'll have a much more consistent and predictable way that compatibility is applied compared to the way you have today. And again, the effect will increase the buildable capacity on the corridors. So next, we'd like to move on to downtown zoning. We've been doing different benchmark testing on all the zones, but there are some things that we're learning, and Greg is going to share some of the findings and some of the approaches that we have for downtown zoning.
Thank you, Peter. Greg Dutton, Planning and Zoning. So I'm going to pivot for a minute to downtown. Council gave us some direction about downtown, and it's up on the screen. I'm just going to read through it. Code and map revisions should maximize potential for employment and residential units within downtown in accordance with the Downtown Austin Plan and the guidance in this document, with affordable housing benefits included and calibrated. And then second piece of direction, the application of non-zoning regulations to smaller remaining downtown sites should allow for greater potential for employment residential units than Draft 3, with affordable housing benefits included and calibrated in accordance with the Downtown Austin Plan and direction of this document. So as you probably know, most of downtown today is zoned central business district or downtown mixed use. Those are zones that have unlimited density. CBD has an FAR of 8:1 with no height limit. DMU has an FAR of 5:1 with 120-foot height limit. And then there are a variety of other zones, mostly in western part of downtown. And for Draft 3, all those zones were translated. CBD became DC. DMU became CC. Those zones are exactly the same as the two main downtown zones we have today. And then the variety of zones that we have today became CC subzones of different kinds. And in doing that, applying that zoning was from the Downtown Austin Plan. Those were zoning recommendations taken out of that plan and mapped for Draft 3. So for the new draft, we're not proposing any change to that downtown zoning. We think it should stay the same. There are a couple of minor tweaks that we are making to the CC zone, adding a little bit of height increase, just 5 feet in some of the subzones to accommodate standard building types, and then increasing the impervious cover by 5% to 100%, adding back 0 lot lines. Those are just small tweaks to the CC zone. So really the overall effect of the change is that we're carrying forward what the downtown plan is recommending as far as zoning is concerned. We're making some tweaks to CC, and really that should help with small site development, we think. And overall, keeping the entitlements about the same where they are today leaves a significant delta for the downtown density bonus, so it keeps that program very appealing for developers. To go into a little bit more with the downtown density bonus, council direction is repeated there at the top, and at the risk of being repetitive, I will read that again. Code and map revisions should maximize potential for employment and residential units within downtown in accordance with the Downtown Austin Plan and the guidance in this document with affordable housing benefits included and calibrated. So the downtown density bonus program that we have today is one of the few things that we've taken from the DAP and put into today's code. And you're probably familiar with the subdistrict map that has FAR and height caps based on different geographies downtown. So that map was carried forward into draft 3 with no change at all. It was exactly what we have today. And what we are thinking about proposing is that some of those subdistricts have their caps taken off. So today there's always either an FAR or a height cap in every subdistrict, but there are projects coming in that are either hitting their FAR cap or trying to go over. And so we're thinking if there's a desire to do that and the market is there, why not unleash potential downtown? Let's take the caps off some of those subdistricts. And the effect of that would just be that we would help maximize potential downtown for residential and employment, but it would also increase capacity for market rate and affordable units. The downtown Austin plan. So it's going to be really repetitive if I read that again. That direction is the same. It's just speaking to calibrating the map and revisions to maximize potential and keep it in accordance with the downtown Austin plan. So there are things in the downtown Austin plan that were pulled into draft 3. So today, again, in our current code, we don't have anything codified from the downtown Austin plan except for the bonus program. So in draft 3, we pulled forward the zoning that was recommended from the downtown Austin plan and some provisions in an overlay that speak to uses, frontages, and compatibility. And so for the new draft, we're imagining that there won't be any change to that. That's going to be carried forward as it was in draft 3. But the effect of that is that it does help implement the downtown Austin plan and respect the work that went into the downtown Austin plan, and it kind of allows for some fine tuning downtown, even down to the street level that's very hard to do with a base zone. So it allows some fine tuning. Downtown parking, we had direction from council as follows. Code revisions should provide that parking structures are able to evolve over time as transportation patterns change, including design standards for structured parking that will facilitate eventual conversion to residential or commercial uses. The manager should determine if parking in certain areas should be counted against FAR, that's floor area ratio. The manager should explore options for adopting parking maximums or minimum unit yield in areas necessary to ensure sufficient transit supportive development. And so today, there are things that we do downtown that we want to carry forward. There are really 4 main things. We have no minimum parking required downtown. There is parking required for accessible spaces. There's a parking maximum, and shared parking is allowed. And we want to carry all of those things forward. In draft 3, we didn't have a parking maximum downtown, and that was an inadvertent omission, so that is coming back for the new draft. There are a few new provisions that we want to propose that we've explored. One of those is that downtown today, if you want to have a commercial parking structure, it's a conditional use permit. But there's a lot of unused parking that exists today, and we think we should just allow that to be used as commercial parking. It would mean that underutilized parking today could be utilized by the public or other tenants. It would just be a way to get that parking that might otherwise be fallow to be used. And in that vein, we want to clarify that shared parking is allowed. It's allowed today, but we want to clarify that you can do shared parking downtown and you don't have to come to the city for review because there's no minimum parking requirement being met. We want to make sure that that's clear because we want it to be as easy as possible, again, so that underutilized parking can be better utilized. And then we did explore the idea of convertible garages and whether parking should be counted against FAR. It doesn't quite seem like the market is there yet as to make it a requirement. We want to make sure that it's allowed, but we kind of want to incentivize it so that if you convert your garage in the future to habitable space, it won't count against the FAR in your zone. And in that way, it's kind of, it's more of a carrot approach than a stick approach. Oops. And so then the effects of the change are just that the market decides the parking downtown up to a point. We will have a maximum that you cannot go over, and we will still have a requirement that accessible spaces are provided. It will mean that underutilized parking will be more easily shared so that hopefully it will depress the need for new parking. And then it will allow spaces for cars today to eventually be converted to spaces for people in the future. I'm going to turn it back over to Anik. She's going to talk to you a little bit about parking citywide.
Thanks, Greg. So in the council direction on May 2nd, you all asked that minimum parking requirements should be generally eliminated in areas that are within a quarter mile of activity centers, activity corridors, and the transit priority network, except that some parking requirements may be maintained for areas where elimination of parking requirements would be particularly disruptive. Conditions to be proposed by staff. So as we've been working on the project, we are taking the approach that defining disruptive is a function of the adequacy of the sidewalk system. So with that approach, I'm going to go through how the draft, how current code through our previous work and what we're thinking in our potential revisions as parking relates to the adequacy and completion of the sidewalk system. It's important to note before I get started that our sidewalk program and our CIP and through the 2016 bond and 2018 bond, we're making significant progress on our sidewalk system. And in coordination of developing this slide with Public Works, when the 2016 bond is complete, over 70% of the sidewalk network in this area will be complete. There's still substantial investment to be made to bring that to 100%, but it's important to note that we're making progress. We're really aligning our CIP investment with the direction here with our land use proposals here with the code. So in current code with relations to sidewalks, right now we require them pretty much at all stages of development, subdivision, building permit, residential review, site plan. We have a fee in lieu option, which is granted at a high frequency, and that's going to become important when I talk about what we started to draft in draft 3. But note that it's given in a high frequency. And there was no requirement, or there is no requirement in current code for rehabilitation of current sidewalks. And we know through the sidewalk plan that the functionality of our existing sidewalk is equally as important as completing our absent sidewalk network. And then in 2017, there was a code amendment that allows for mitigation outside of a transportation impact analysis for smaller projects, and that is allowing us to get more sidewalk construction that matches our investment with our CIP. So in our previous work, when it came to roadways, sometimes there was requests to not build the sidewalk at the same time as the road, and so we clarified that the sidewalk would need to be constructed at the same time as street construction as required by the code. We strengthened the administrative review for fee in lieu, and that's important. We want the ability for the sidewalk program to be able to assess what would be the most efficient for that particular site with regards to whether it makes more sense for the city to take a fee in lieu and complete a sidewalk segment in that area, or does it make more sense for the developer to construct in that area? And we have a very fine-tuned sidewalk program, and so we've strengthened the ability for our review and not make it so automatic that fee in lieu, not make it so easy for fee in lieu to be granted. And then lastly, we put a requirement in for rehabilitation to bring existing sidewalks up to ADA and other standards. So all of those things that we teed up in our previous work are carrying forward to the revisions that we're doing now. And in service to council direction, in looking at this disruptive clause, that we are thinking about parking not being required within a quarter mile of centers, corridors, or the Transportation Priority Network, TPN, if you're on an accessible route. So if the site is on an accessible route per our sidewalk system, you can take advantage of no parking. Then we'll go further in developing code requirements that some parking or some other type of mitigation could be required if you're not on an accessible route. So that is our context-sensitive approach to the council direction. And the effect of the change would be parking reductions would be applied in areas conducive to multimodal transportation options where we want to promote walking to the corridor, cycling to the corridor, using transit, et cetera, and integrating land use regulations with mobility infrastructure. And now to parking maximums. Council also directed on May 2nd that the manager should explore options for adopting parking maximums in areas necessary to ensure sufficient transit-supportive development. So in current code, as Greg pointed out, parking maximums exist only in the CBD and in some regulating plans across the city. In our previous work, we modernized parking requirements for all of the uses in the code. They hadn't been looked at in quite a while, and took, like, looking at restaurant or other uses and looked at what is a more appropriate modernized amount of parking to apply. So generally, parking requirements went down in our previous work, and then we set a citywide maximum of 200% of that amount. Right now, we're considering, per council direction, 100% maximum downtown, and then 150% for sites on centers, corridors, and on the transit priority network, and then keeping with that 200% citywide. Now, it's important to note that we want to take a data-driven approach to this. Parking is sensitive, and so we have folks on our cross-functional team pulling 3 to 5 years worth of site plans in certain contextual situations to look at how much parking has been provided. Our current code allows over parking in most areas, unless you're in the CBD where there's some maximums. And even with the maximums that are in the code, there is still provisions to have those waived. And so once we get that data back, the centers, corridors, transportation priority network, and citywide may change a bit. But it's important to note, in relationship to each other, of course, the downtown should be the lower cap and so on. It makes the most logical sense. So the effect of the change is a TDM first approach to transportation mitigation, as we know that parking is one of the biggest incentives to driving, and we want to support a reliable high-frequency transit system and allow for development to focus on housing people versus housing cars. So that concludes the bulk of a summary of the work we've been doing in those 3 areas, and I'll briefly touch on next steps, and then we'll be available to answer your questions. So in the timeline, again, we'll be talking with you all on September 11th, and we plan to touch on zoning outside of the transition areas, as well as NCCDs, NCOs, and then parkland and other dedications, and some administrative processes that we're teeing up in service to council direction. October is going to be a very, very busy month. We will have 2 open houses. We'll have public testing. We'll start our office hours that will extend through October, through November, onward through December if necessary, and that's the opportunity for residents to come talk with staff about a particular property or really about anything that they might want to know about the code and the draft that's out. We are still scheduled for October 4th release of the code staff report and map. And then, again, Planning Commission public hearing on October 26th. We welcome any district meetings that you would like to have. We'll make ourselves available. Some of you have already contacted me about specific dates, which is fantastic. And we, like I said, will make ourselves available to assist you with assuring that your constituency is well informed about the project as it moves forward. So with that, we are here to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for daylighting this. It was very clear. Questions? Anybody have any questions? Yes, Natasha.
I have one question. On page 27, of the presentation under potential revisions. Parking not required within a quarter mile of centers, corridors, or TPN if on an accessible route. I'd just like to get some clarity about how you're defining accessible route.
Sure. Our sidewalk program in Public Works, we use the American Disabilities Act definition of accessible route, and essentially the sidewalk, there has to be a sidewalk route with appropriate curb ramps, appropriate design standards to the street or to a public facility. No breaks in the sidewalk route.
Does that get it, Natasha?
Yes.
Leslie?
Good to see you all. Couple of questions. Transition zones. Will the transition zones and the by right allowable units apply everywhere across the city and in each district?
So the by right units within the transition areas will be those missing middle zones that are applied within there. So those zones are, as we kind of mentioned in the last council session, work session, are 2 zones, and they are 4 units by right per lot and 6 units by right per lot with an additional bonus on top of that.
So my question was, will the transition zones and the by right allowable units apply everywhere across the city and in each district?
No, Councilmember. Those
Okay.
are unique to the transition zones. Those zones and the 4 and the 6 plus additional bonus are unique to the zones that would be applied in the transition zone and not elsewhere throughout the city.
Would you say that everywhere transition zones are mapped, these 2 criteria will apply?
Can you
Yes.
specify which 2 criteria you're referring to?
Basically. Well, I was asking if this applied across the city in transition zones, and I got a definition of what a transition zone is, which I already knew, and then I got an answer that says, yes, where the transition zones will be mapped. And so my question is, do we have a sense of exactly where those transition zones will be now?
Right. So again, this is what I was speaking to earlier, the importance of. So the transition areas are the areas as identified by council direction, right? Against those 4 criteria. Those are what the staff are using as transition areas. The zone districts that are being used in the transition areas, there are 2 types, and we would describe those as missing middle zones. As Lacey mentioned, one of them, the less intensive one, is base entitlement of 4 units per lot, and the next one is 6 units per lot, and both have density bonus available. We'll call those missing middle zones. They're not exclusive to, if this is your question, they're not necessarily exclusive to being applied in transition areas. There are other parts of the city that are today zoned a multi-unit zone, that one of these missing middle zones might be an appropriate zone to use.
Okay.
Does that help?
It does.
Yeah.
So indeed, transition zones and the by right allowable units could, depending on the circumstance, apply everywhere across the city and in every district.
Every council district. Are there transition zones that have this in council districts all over the city? Are there
And it may be
transition?
that at this point, we're going to need a map to see where
Yeah.
all those are. So maybe the next time you all are going to come on September 11 to talk to us again, maybe we could have a map to show where the transition
No,
zones
I think the question was, where are the transition areas? And I think what you said is, it's the same as according to the existing council direction, which
That's
is
right.
transition areas will be adjacent to activity centers, corridors, and the transit priority network, which extend into every council district but do not cover every council district. And that they will go generally 2 to 5 lots deep based on how you've calculated it, and it will never take up the majority of any given neighborhood as you've described it. So I think that's the,
Yeah, what I was looking
That's-
for
I
was a
think that's the
general understanding that we were all anticipating that everybody would have some skin in this game. And I just wanted
Yeah.
to make sure that that was.
I think where we were missing stuff is the districts. She was talking about council districts,
Right.
not zoning or planning districts.
Oh, yeah. council
Will we have
districts.
transition zones in council districts
Yeah.
throughout the city?
I have a related question, but I'll let her finish.
Okay. Leslie?
So let's see. I wanted to ask a question about lower impervious cover in the watersheds and how staff will address that requirement, since it looks like impervious cover is proposed to be higher in the two transition zones. You did have a slide with a flood zone.
Yes, so watershed staff is still developing their calculations based on what we learned at our benchmark testing. And so we're not prepared to discuss that today. And I know they would want to be present to explain their calculations, but generally what we're learning is that in the transition areas for the missing middle zones, that we are looking at increase in impervious cover, but how that also complies with the council direction of not increasing it citywide and also against watersheds. And so we believe that we are going to be able to make that work, but it's still in development, and we'll be prepared at one of the next work sessions to have watershed come explain those calculations. But as you can imagine, those are complex and they're still working on them.
We had at an open house town hall with with our flood folks in my district, and there was a high level of concern about that. So yeah, they'll want to hear directly from staff on that. There's already a lot of local area flooding in my district in the central city areas like Brentwood, and that's due to aging infrastructure and undersized pipes, and of course more extreme rainfall events. So if we're already experiencing flooding under current conditions, how is staff predicting conditions will be improved if we are going to see higher impervious cover allowances? And that may be a question to park and address when we have our flood folks here, but I would like to have y'all's input on that. I'll just run through these and then because then I'll be done. On the parking, on page 27, you've got that table there, the parking minimums for areas where there is a low walkability score and few sidewalks. What plans do you have for addressing that, in particular in ways that would support people who may be in wheelchairs or who otherwise would be affected by the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Can you repeat the question?
This goes to sidewalks and where we have low walkability scores and few sidewalks. How are parking minimums for those areas going to be handled, where we have low walkability scores and few sidewalks?
Yeah, so what we're proposing is defining disruptive by the adequacy of the completeness of the sidewalk network. So in areas that are in the quarter mile that are not on an accessible route or don't have complete sidewalk systems, we'd be looking at ways to have a context-sensitive approach to how much parking might be appropriate in those areas if the sidewalk system is not complete. So we haven't landed on what that might look like. If there's an accessible route, can go to zero parking, cannot do parking, and try to in service of the council direction of maximizing affordability in units as the general direction. But where that starts to deteriorate, we are looking at what is that right application of the amount of parking that would be required, since it is in that quarter mile of the transit priority corridor and the activity corridors. And it is where we want to marry that land use and mobility integration. And so we feel like it should be a little different of a requirement than throughout the whole city. But we understand that if the sidewalk network is not complete, that there should be a sensitivity to that.
Right, and we also talked before when we had these conversations last year about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the need for parking for people who have disabilities, and that was part of the direction that was in the guidance document to the city manager that we incorporate ADA requirements into these discussions. So I'm just looking to see that that is actually being embedded in here and that the discussion that we're having here would include that. The last thing I want to ask with regard to sidewalks and walkability and parking minimums, are we going to tie the condition of our sidewalks to some kind of a process that would be triggered automatically, where the condition of the sidewalks is so deteriorated that they're impassable, and that we have kind of a SWOT approach so that the city goes out within, I don't know, the shot clock on site plans is 30 days, so maybe we have a shot clock for repairing our sidewalks so that the walkability is ensured. In other words, I want to tie the condition of the sidewalks to our public works staff so it triggers projects, and they go out and they know that they have to repair the sidewalks and that it's done really quickly if we are going to be in a situation where we are relying on our sidewalks for people to get around.
We'd be happy to coordinate with Public Works on programmatic improvements that would run alongside any code regulations. So we're happy to take that idea and see how does that differ or is in line with what we might be doing currently, what we might improve upon, so that there's a lot of programmatic elements. The code is not the only regulatory tool and has to work in concert with our program. So that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, these are some things that residents have been bringing to my attention. They're not necessarily opposed to having, in many instances, they do have questions about the reduction in the parking minimums. And that was an element that I opposed specifically when we did our voting on this document that you guys are working from, that we submitted back in May. But as a trade-off to that, we have to ensure as a community that the sidewalks are going to be passable. And if they deteriorate and we're behind the curve in repairs, we have to be able to explain that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it'd be great if we could somehow tie that then to the work that our crews do on the streets.
Thank you. Ann?
I have a number of questions. I'll try not to ask them all.
Okay. And we can give everybody a chance to kind of circle through
Sure.
a couple times. That'd be okay, too.
Okay.
Greg will be after you.
Okay. So I'll focus on, I will defer my parking questions, and I'll focus on the transition zone questions. So I wanted to follow up on a question that Councilmember Poole asked because I wasn't quite sure if I heard the response. So, and I think and that was the question about the all over the city question. And to my question related to that is I'm looking at the direction under N, under that, under the, that question number 4, where it talks about staff will consider mapping missing middle areas in high opportunity areas not impacted by environmental concerns in order to help achieve goals related to housing throughout the city. So I guess am I assuming correctly that because this references mapping missing middle areas that perhaps y'all haven't, are y'all considering that a different subject than the transition zones, and have you gotten to that yet? Or is that, does that subject apply to the criteria we're talking about today? Is my question clear? So in other words, I was reading staff will consider mapping missing middle areas as staff will consider transition zones, but perhaps y'all are putting that into another category and you're going to think about it later? Or am I asking do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, I believe I do. So,
Okay.
yes, there's the transition areas criteria.
Okay.
And if the direction to also, review high opportunity areas
Right.
for this missing middle housing opportunity is sort of separate
Okay.
from that.
So y'all
Not
will you be getting back to us later about your criteria for that?
Yes.
Okay. Then my next question is relates to some of the other criteria that are in here related to transition zones. So I think I understood correctly, and thanks for the illustrations. That really helps understand it. So if I'm understanding correctly, you set the depth, the 2 to 5 depth, based on those 4 criteria, and if they met 4, they got a 5, 5 in. If they met less, they got some number less than that. So in general, that's the approach, right? Okay. So then related to that, my question would be how were you thinking about that third criteria in that list of 4, which is well-connected street grid? So how did you define whether something got a check mark for that third category?
So if we want to go back to the slide on, is that 18?
Page 18?
Page 8, slide 18 on page 18. Yes.
Okay.
So this is trying to kind of visualize what those differences between well-connected and not well-connected means.
Okay.
So we have on the left hand of the slide what we would call well-connected grid. There are short blocks, there are breaks in the streets and breaks in the blocks. Whereas on the right-hand side of the slide, there are really, really deep lots on the corridor. And the residential area is further away from the corridor and outside of that transition area as we've defined it. So as you can see, there's even that kind of cul-de-sac in the middle of that big corridor, deep corridor lot that isn't connected to, if there was a cut through in between those lots instead of the cul-de-sac ending, we could consider that connected to the corridor. But in this instance, the distance, when you actually think about the wrapping around to get to the corridor, is further than that 5-minute walk shed.
Okay. All right. So I think I understand. So this map shows us that for this particular illustration, this is an area that meets all 5 or all 4 of that list, except for this area where we show the cul-de-sac. So the depth into that area goes whatever that is, 3 or whatever. But then to the top and the bottom of it, it stays at the 5 end. So that's how you were thinking of.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So on the left side of the corridor, right, you see the transition area and the mapping of the missing middle zones, right? And on the right side of the corridor, there's no mapping of the transition area. The missing middle zones are not applied in that situation. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Then I'll just ask a few more then on those to make sure I'm understanding them. Okay, so then when we get to, I wanted to understand how you were thinking of applying the orientation of blocks relative to the corridors criterion. So I can see the illustration on page 19, and that's an illustration about the floodplains, and I assume that that's relating to, and that would apply to drainage and flooding considerations, not just floodplain, right? Okay, so that's a yes, drainage and flooding, not just floodplain. I mean,
Define what you mean by drainage.
Well, that's my question. I mean, one of the criteria is there's 5 criteria that you consider, and drainage and flooding considerations is the criteria. So are you defining that as floodplain, or are you defining it, have you defined it yet?
So working with the watershed department, at this point, we've defined it as the floodplain, the Atlas 14 floodplain data that they have at this moment.
Okay, so that's how it's, okay. That's how it's defined. Okay, then getting back to the other question, the first one is orientation of blocks relative to the corridors. So if you have a block coming in at an angle, I'm trying to think about how that applies. Have y'all thought about that yet? Because I'm not really seeing an illustration of that.
We kept our lines straight in these illustrations. Yes. So using this slide 17 as kind of an example, you see how even though we have straight lines and orientations, the block of the lots, or the facing of the lot changes their orientation away from the corridor.
Okay.
So think of the any portion of this slide where the angles of the streets start to diverge in a 45-degree angle. That transition area depth is measured along that angle to define the same distance from the corridor.
Well, that's really my question. I'm wondering why it's the same distance. That's what I'm not quite understanding, particularly for an angle. And I need to see that.
Yeah, we
That-
can definitely visualize it.
I don't understand why coming in at an angle might impact the number of lots in. It would seem to me that it would. So we can have further conversation about that. It's easier to see if you've got some kind of grid, but coming in at an angle doesn't do the same thing for the lots. And so can we have further conversation about that then? Okay. I'll pass it on to someone else, and then just if you could come back to me.
Greg?
Hi. First, thanks for all of the work. I know it was a lot of work in a short amount of time. To clarify on parking, y'all are intending to keep the other evolutions on our parking minimums that you had in draft 3 and then enhancing that with the new direction, right?
That's correct.
Great. And, you know, one thing that I'm thinking about, and of course it could be something Planning Commission and Council handles or something that you all think about between here and October 4th, is that there being no parking probably only creates an impact over time. Usually, most of it a positive impact, but there could be, you know, some of the conflicts people have seen. But it would take time for a lot of new places to develop with less or no parking. So I guess a question might be, how are we thinking about, or for you to think about, if we're planning on building a sidewalk, or if there's a small gap and we're thinking of filling it, you know, we might actually wind up having the full sidewalk connectivity over the course of a year or two, but having no parking minimum, a new building may not develop for a year or two, and you may not see a real reduction in parking ratio there per person over the course of 5 or 6 or 7 years. So it might be, I see that it's a pretty simple solution to say let's have the no parking within a quarter mile when there is a sidewalk network. But if there's likely going to be a sidewalk network completed within the next 2 or 3 years, and the Land Development Code's parking reductions may not have much of an impact for 5 or 10 years, I would hate for us to set our Land Development Code regs based on what's on the ground right now if we're going to change what's on the ground over the course of a short time period. So maybe just something for us to think about, unless you all have already.
We have
made
been
that
thinking
adjustment.
about that. Thank you for confirming that. You know, we are thinking about that, and we're trying to figure out how to go further than what we've presented here today. But we generally wanted to talk about, you know, the idea of defining disruptive by the adequacy of the sidewalks and not tying it to a use per se. And then if that lands well, how can we be thinking about the future as well? Because you're exactly right. We're making great progress with our sidewalk CIP. And once the parking is there, it's there for a long time, and it could take the place of a unit, which is the overall goal. And so we are still developing what that might look like.
And especially since so many of our sidewalks are prioritized based on where it's walkable and where there's people walking, if we continue to plan to have more parking and less other stuff, then we can continue to have not having sidewalks there and perpetuate the thing we're trying to get rid of. And so I think that it is a thoughtful solution for y'all to be thinking about where sidewalks currently exist, but we might want to find some way to be forward looking.
I would say that this is the fortunate thing, right? I mean, the making of a city, right? There's the regulatory stuff, there's the infrastructure stuff, there's the partnership, you know. And so here's a case where you all have made a significant investment in your sidewalk infrastructure. And right within 5 years, 70% of these areas will have the sidewalk available. So it's one of those examples where Austin is, you know, you're not relying on your regulatory leverages to get the public amenities, right? You're putting in the public amenities, which is actually assisting you to get the land use and the development that is going to help make the transit and make the corridors achieve those outcomes that you're looking for.
And then I didn't hear whether you said 225 or 2 or 5. Are there transition areas that are 3 and 4 lots deep?
Yes, it's 225,
Got
so
it.
it's a range.
Got it. And then but regardless, if it is within a vulnerable area under the UT study, then it is 2 lots,
Correct.
or however it is you count to 2. Okay, that is helpful. I think those are my questions for now.
Paige?
Could you talk a little bit about the quarter mile around the activity centers and corridors? I know these are great charts on transition zones, but I know some of them are circular, and I wasn't sure exactly how those are measured and what that might look like.
So the quarter mile measurement is just that. It's kind of a blob of a measurement used to tell us where to hone in and really review for, say, like at least for transition areas mapping, correct? So since a lot of our centers are currently circles, in the initial, data calculations of what's within a quarter mile of there, that will come out as a circle. And just like since our corridors are a line, it comes out as a very thick quarter mile line. So everything we're doing, at least as far as mapping is concerned, is using this quarter mile distance as an initial instigator for where areas need to be reviewed for different levels of mapping.
And then you can hone in closer and see what.
Correct.
What
So
the streets really
that's
look
more of the
like.
data-driven aspect, right? What is a quarter mile? What does that encompass? And then that leads us to the next area of the real context-driven, more manual review that staff is doing.
Okay, great. And just to clarify, I know you mentioned Atlas 14, so I'm sure you're in communication about what our updated flood zones are going to look like. I just wanted to make sure we were understanding that conversation's happening.
Yes, we've been working with them closely to talk about where those are located and what those impervious cover implications could be.
Great, thanks.
Kathy, and then Delia.
I have quite a few questions. I'll try to stop at a good point so we can circulate, but I do have more to come back to. But on that point, could you help me understand, though, what our transition, I know I heard you say in the presentation transition zones are not being mapped on projects on lots that are in the floodplain. Are those taking into account the new Atlas? I mean, I know you said you're having conversations around the Atlas 14 maps, but are you assuming by floodplain, can we assume that those take into account the new Atlas maps, and that the new Atlas, the areas that are coming into the floodplain because of the new maps are excluded from transition zone mapping?
So I can only speak to the data that we have now. I can't speak to the future specifics, and I think that might be a question that we have to work through with our watershed department, because they have provided us the information on what is encompassed in this floodplain area.
Okay, yeah, I think that's important. That's a question that we've had a lot of. Are the new Atlas maps, are you crafting a code that responds to the new maps? And especially since there were choices made about not mapping to floodplain, I would hope that includes our new floodplain areas. So with regard to the 2 different levels of intensity, it was the lower level is 4 units plus a bonus. How many units are achievable through the bonus, and what is the affordability provision?
It's up to 8 units total with the bonus.
With the lower intensity?
Yes. So the plus 4 of the units. And Greg might be able to speak better to all the specifics in the bonus if I forget them. There is no height bonus.
Okay, so the number of units in the lower intensity transition zone are up to 8 units.
Correct.
And what about the higher intensity transition zone? 6 units plus a bonus of how many?
Also plus 4, so up to 10.
And what is the affordability commitment in either of those? So with the 4 units plus the 4 bonus, so with the 8 units, what would be your affordability commitment?
I think, Councilmember, we might have to check with NHCD on that and get back to you. We're not sure what the set-aside percentage is, but we can certainly find out.
Is the same true for the 10 units, category of 10 units?
Yeah, the same answer. We'd
Okay.
need to check with NHCD.
So we know what the total allowable unit is, but we don't know what the affordability component is.
We know, we don't know up here, but
Yeah,
NHCD
okay.
does, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was just,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to suggest nobody knew. And is there any affordability component in the base level entitlement? I mean, with the rezoning, is there any affordability component, or it just kicks in at the bonus? In other words, our area is going to be upzoned into transition, one of these two transition, without necessarily having an affordability component. I mean, it sounds like the answer is yes.
So that the zone includes the affordability component, but the answer is yes, that the by right entitlements will go up to 4, and then therefore on top of that when participation occurs in the bonus.
But if I have a tract right now on which I can only build 2 units, if it's rezoned for the lower intensity transition, I can build 4
Correct.
without any affordability.
That's correct.
Okay. And then, let's see, with regard to I think some of the understanding kind of how this really applies in different areas is obviously very challenging because we're not looking at the maps, but I appreciate all the work that you've done to provide us with the different scenarios here. Can you help us understand how you are adjusting? I've heard a couple times the context-specific mapping. How are you dialing it back when you have situations where you are hitting that point where 5 lots and 5 lots from either corridor is encompassing most of an entire neighborhood?
Right, that is definitely one of our considerations as part of this more manual, eyes on the ground or eyes on the map process. So we are taking big precautions to make sure as we manually map these missing middle zones in these areas that they are not only not touching but not encompassing the majority of the area.
So what does that look like? Are you going then back to two units?
It does get reduced, yes. It's not a specific number. It's based on how large the area is, but it is reduced.
And then how are you, I mean, these lots on all the maps, and I understand the necessity of presenting them this way, but at least in certain areas of town, you have very consistent size lots, and in other areas, you have very inconsistently sized lots. And so I heard you talk about a measure, and I think it was 850 feet, but I had previously heard 800 feet.
850 feet is the measurement that we have reached as the maximum level of transition area depth based on the measurement of the application of missing middle zones. So that's really where all of your criteria are met. There are no environmental constraints. You're not overlapping with the majority of the single-family area. It is really, that is the maximum that these get to. In other areas where we're going to less lots deep, or there's other implications of constraints, the depth is much less.
So is it 5 lots or 850? Is it sometimes more than 8? Is it sometimes more than 5 lots?
So no, when it comes to creating, and if you'd like to pull up slide 17, that's always a helpful image. So the 5 lots, you never exceed 5 lots when you're looking at this parallel block pattern and the definition of defining what the transition area is. And each corridor has their different levels of these parallel block formations. Using those and creating the depth of the transition area based off those, which can range in depth, and again, but not over the 850 feet in depth. Using that to then, as we see here on the right, apply that same distance. And so we can and may, and many times, have more than 5 lots on a specific block in the transition area, but to the measurement definition from this parallel block formation, the transition area does not exceed 5 lots. Lots of numbers.
Okay, I somewhat understand that. I mean, I think what you're saying is you're not going beyond 850, and you're not going beyond 5 unless 5 in one area is adjacent to an area where it might be 8 next to it.
So like in this instance, unless the orientation of the block within that distance, let's say this is 850 feet on the left, we've measured that the transition area is 850 feet. Down on the kind of the bottom quadrant of the slide, it is still no more than 850 feet, but can capture more lots.
Okay, so sometimes it is beyond
Right.
five lots.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess my last question, so in terms of, is there any consideration for sizing as I started my question and then I looped around to a different one, but as you look at areas that have maybe a larger lot than a smaller one, most of them in some of our older neighborhoods are really mixed up in terms of size. Are you still doing 1 through 5?
For the sake of for the sake of this measurement, if on the left-hand slide here we had the lot adjacent to the corridor was smaller than the rest of the lots, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that distance is still measured. So we're still capturing the 5 lots, but now the distance is shorter, that transition area.
But
because
it
some
still
of the lots
ends
are
at
different
5.
size.
Or less. So if you look at on the left side, transition area, and the area on the right under transition area. So on the left side, sort of the simplest situation establishes 5 lots deep. And using that same dimension on the right side, it's only going 3 lots deep. Right? So it's maintaining essentially the depth of that transition area, which, as Lacey said, has never exceeded 850 feet, and is usually, I don't know, 600 feet or something like that,
Yeah, it ranges.
700
5 to
feet.
7.
So just to give you a sense, 750 feet would be a 3-minute walk, right? So it's a pretty short distance to connect to the corridor.
And so I guess my last question for now, and then I do have others that I'll wait to come back around. So you mentioned a couple of times context-specific mapping, and I think in your last presentation last week, and it might have been you, Peter, if you were here last week. Were you here last week? Okay, then it wasn't you. Someone made the comment that it's difficult to do things on a lot-by-lot basis, but as you look at context-specific mapping, are you attending to the fact that in some of these transition zones we already have missing middle housing, and if so, are they still getting mapped with transition zones? It sounds like the answer is yes, but I'm just wondering if that's been a consideration you've taken into effect. That in mapping you would be changing the zoning on tracts that are already producing missing middle and potentially incentivizing the redevelopment of what is existing missing middle right now.
We are receiving data on where as per the direction that y'all provided of where affordable multifamily is provided, and in these areas, if they were to somehow right now have a zoning that's lower than their current entitlements, we're not increasing those entitlements. And so in these transition areas, we are taking into that factor this data of where do we have, to the best of our abilities, a market affordable multifamily.
But that's just market affordable. That's just market affordable multifamily. That's not necessarily the 4-plex, a block off Guadalupe, or
I do
the
have to
little
double
8-plex.
check
That
the data.
that wouldn't fall into that provision. We had a lot of discussion about it, and I don't think we. I don't believe that we agreed on a measure for that, though I continue to think it's critically important that we look at it. It sounds like now there is not a difference. That context-specific mapping is not taking into account those
If there's
existing missing middle.
Missing middle.
We need to, I need to make a confirmation that
Okay.
what level of multifamily is considered in that data. That is a good point. I need
Yeah.
to
Thank you.
And I could also say that, it's possible that there are existing missing middle that are non-conforming structures today. So that actually
few.
mapping the new missing middle zone would legalize them, right?
Well,
Would
and-
to bring them into conformance
It
versus
may, but it
non-conforming status
also,
today.
I think it also has a possibility of doing what I explained. And I think I may have showed some photos of this in one of our work sessions, but, on a particular street, and it's not an uncommon street, but just in one of the examples I showed this council, we had a couple houses off Guadalupe, you had a 4-plex, probably not conforming to the zoning.
Okay.
duplex, a little eightplex. I mean, those may not match the zoning, and so you wouldn't necessarily know about it as you look at a zoning chart, but I think there's a high chance that if these get mapped with those kinds of increased entitlements, we'll see the redevelopment of the eightplex, we'll see the redevelopment of the fourplex, and I'm not sure that's in the best interest if what we're trying to provide, if what we're trying to do is look at housing costs as well.
Well, if
Not
it's,
just
if
the
it's,
quantity of housing,
yeah.
but also
If it's
doing our best to preserve the existing structures that are there.
yeah. If it's 4 today, and then the new zone would apply a base zone of 4, it would legalize what's already on the ground versus not conforming. And then if it were to redevelop, because the incentive of the affordable density bonus is attractive enough, then it might develop, and then you would get affordable housing in addition to the additional density. But otherwise, you would basically be applying a new missing middle zone that would basically legalize an existing condition. It doesn't necessarily accelerate or make it, redevelop faster, because it's basically the base entitlement is a base.
In that case, it won't. I mean, in the case of the fourplex, it might not. In the case of the duplex with the ADU, it might. I mean, I think that's the complication we have around that, and it does sound like that's not a level of context specificity that you're able to do at this stage. Well, thank you very much for your work. And again, I think I have more questions eventually.
Questions kind of along the lines of Councilmember Tovo. But I just want to, because I wrote these down, you said that, so the orange and the yellow would never exceed 6 units, right? You said 4 or 6?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, correct. As the
Okay.
base units.
Okay, so.
As a base.
Four.
As a base zoning.
The base.
So the max would be 10. If the bonus is taken, the max could be 10. So it's 4 base and then 6 base with 4 available with a bonus on each of them. So it ranges from 4 to 10 in the zone is the range.
Okay, so if there's a 4-unit in the 4-unit base, it could be redeveloped, but it would mean that they're adding 4 affordable units. They would have to be adding 4 affordable units? No. How many?
No, the base, you could redevelop with 4 market rate units. You could also take advantage of the bonus and add up to 4 more. In the lower zone, in the higher zone, you could do 6 market rate, and you could add 4, up to 4 affordable.
Is it?
I thought that's
You
what I
Not-
said.
told
not
us you
affordable.
weren't sure what the
They're not
affordability
all affordable.
component would be. So those additional 4 might not all be affordable.
Correct.
correct.
That's
That's
still
correct.
being calibrated, and Erica's here.
Hi, Erica Leak, Neighborhood Housing. Yes, I just wanted to confirm that we're still working with consultants on the calibration of the affordable units, but in most cases, it would not be that, all 4 of the additional units would be affordable. It would be some percentage of the bonus units that would be affordable, and that's what we're calibrating.
Okay. And then, I think you mentioned it, and I'm sorry if somebody already asked this and I missed it. You said that there would, I'm thinking of like corridors like South First and Congress that have very few blocks in some parts of it between those two. You said that there would never be an instance where like the entire neighborhood is all transition zone, is that right?
Correct.
Right. And how would you, is it based on the 700 feet, 850 feet? What is it?
No, it's much more manual than that. It's
Okay.
really based on what would you be going to in the first place, right? What would we be mapping up to if we were defined, and then reducing that down to half its distance or a third. It's less of it's a 2 here if it encompasses the area. It's more of just reducing it so that it does not encompass the entire area. There is not a as defined number as like some of our initial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is like some of our initial criteria application. But it is just really manually looking at these areas and making sure that if a transition area is overlapping the majority of the area, that we reduce it down so that it does not do so.
Okay. And then the only other question I had was, is there a map that exists that shows the overlay of the 4 I guess, factors when determining, it's on slide 5. Do we have is there a map available?
Yeah, and I think we'll be discussing that at one of our future meetings here soon. I'm not, the 11th maybe, or.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll be coming with that soon, so y'all can understand what these areas are that we're talking about.
But is that map available now for people to see?
No, I don't think we have it
Okay.
online yet.
But it will be?
Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
In the transition areas. Thank you. In the transition areas, thanks. In the transition areas, what kind of scale or volume are we looking at as we increase the number of units? Can you get up to 60 feet in height, 65 feet in height in a transition area?
So in the transition areas, these two zones that we keep talking about, right behind the corridor, we're imagining that that's a zone where you can get up to 45 feet in height at the most. There is no height bonus with that zone. There's a unit bonus, but not a height bonus. And then in the yellow lots behind the orange, you can get up to the base height is 35 feet, and that does have a 10-foot affordability bonus included as a part of the affordability package. But you can never get up to 65 feet.
We had talked sometime in the past about residential house form. Is that still being carried through here in the transition areas? Would you explain what that is?
Yeah, we've talked in the past about residential house scale, and there are zones that fall into that group. In draft 3, it was the zones up to R4, which is the 4-unit zone. That's considered residential house scale. And that's because it's got a base height of 35 feet, and the impervious cover standards and other site development standards are very close to a single-family zone. The zone that's right behind the corridor, where you can get 6 base plus 4, that can go up to 45 feet, and that's not considered a residential house scale zone, but the lower intensity transition zone is.
Okay. So in that lower intensity transition area that abuts the single-family homes that are being kept the same, what would be built there would be something that might have more units, but it's still going to be a residential house scale. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I got asked a question, 2 questions as I was coming down here. Let me ask them real fast. Is there a requirement that units that are developed in the transition area be rental units as opposed
There is
to
not.
sale units?
There is not. We don't. The code doesn't speak to ownership structure.
Okay. And then is there going, we talked about incentivizing or incenting preserving of existing homes, so you wouldn't tear down a home and build a bigger single-family home. Are you doing any of that incentivizing of maintaining the existing home in the transition areas?
We are, yeah. The preservation incentive, which I think we've talked a bit about before, will exist so that if the original structure is preserved on the property, additional units or square footage can be added without counting against the base FAR.
In order to preserve the existing home?
Correct.
Okay. Allison, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you initiating these updates. I think it's really useful for us to be able to understand some of the background and the context before we get to October, so thank you. I wanted to follow up on some of the questions that the mayor had. I'm trying to understand the mass and scale in the transition area. And you mentioned some stuff about the height. So I'm understanding that the darker orange color can go up to 45 feet. There's no height bonus. And that the yellowish orange one is 35 feet, but there's a 10-foot affordable bonus. And in the light yellow, it can go from 4 to 8, and the other can go from 6 to 10 in number of units. There are other measures of building mass and scale. Can you talk about those, and also about the impervious cover changes, and if there's also issues about lot size that we need to keep in mind?
Sure. So you got it exactly right in your summary. The impervious cover limits for the less intense missing middle zone, that's 50%. And then in the more intense zone, it's 60%.
And what would that be now under single family?
Under single family today, the impervious cover is 45%.
Okay. And what about FAR?
FAR, so today, FAR varies depending on where you are in the city. In the McMansion area, there's an FAR cap, but outside of that, there is not. But what we're imagining for the new zones is that there will be an FAR cap, and that's the leverage that we use for the preservation incentive. So these new missing middle zones will have an FAR limit.
About what?
For the less intense zone, the FAR is 0.4. And some of these zones, the FAR varies by use. So for instance, in the R4 zone, which is the less intense missing middle zone, we have an FAR of 0.4. You do get a little bit more FAR if you participate in the bonus by providing multifamily. So you get a bump in FAR 0.2. And that just makes that multifamily product more feasible.
Okay, I'm going to have to digest that one.
He started to answer your question about the more intense, but I'm not sure we got those numbers.
I'm sorry. The more intense missing middle zone, it has an FAR of 0.8 for multifamily, and then you get an additional 1.2 if you participate in the affordability bonus. And then for a duplex, the base FAR is a little bit less. It's 0.6. And so again, it does vary by use.
Will we be able to sort of see this and play with it? Because it's confusing.
Yes.
In this setup to understand
I
how
know,
that is translating, because, part of what the concern I'm hearing is what this mass and scale looks like in terms of how it's transforming, and how are we understanding what we're getting with these units, what the impact is on flooding if you're increasing the impervious cover. And, it's one thing to talk about 4 units and 8 units or 6 units, whatever. It's another thing when you actually understand what is the mass and scale of how do you take my single family house and turn it into 8 units when you have a 6,000 square foot lot, and that translation isn't easy to make in one's head. And it may not be possible. You may need to have multiple lots together, but I think that's part of the explanation that we need to be able to communicate to people about what this is going to mean in their neighborhood. So if we can get some of those numbers out so people can see that, and, taking a standard lot, what does this actually mean if I have a single family lot in a orange transition zone? How are you going to take my lot and change it into 10 units? Like, what does that mean?
And I know that part of council's direction, I believe, and what staff is planning to do is come back with some models to show what that looks like, that scale.
Okay, and I wanted to clarify that for the bonus units, the affordability, does that have to be in units, or is that also fee in lieu? Because given what we've been seeing on all sorts of other developments, it's never going to be more than 1 unit out of the 4. Or it won't pencil out according to what we're being told. Whether it could pencil out, I don't know. But
Lauren Avioli, Neighborhood Housing and Community Development. So we still are working on the set-aside percentages, which was said previously. And we are still, as in draft 3, proposing to have a fee in lieu option for the citywide affordable housing bonus program. However, we want to bring forward some criteria that kind of help us determine when a fee in lieu would be appropriate, as was asked by council sort of at the end of the draft 3 work sessions and deliberations that y'all had last year. So we will have that in the draft.
I'd like to also know a similar information on the massive scale for the corridors, for the zoning that's going to happen on the corridors, what we're talking about, and how that affordability plays into that, what the impervious covers limits are, all those kinds of things, and also how it varies, because we can talk about corridors, but we actually have multiple different types of corridors, and Imagine Austin activity corridor and a transit priority corridor that is, in the middle of a bunch of neighborhoods, is on a 2-lane road, is different. And I think we need to understand what that scale is as well. I think people are not just concerned about the transition areas, they're also trying to understand what's going to go on those corridors, particularly the transit ones that are not the corridors that people have gotten used to thinking of in that manner. I don't know if you have that today or when we will be seeing that.
Yeah, we can certainly bring that back at a future work session.
Okay, I think.
And we'll be considering that as we're doing the context sensitivity to applying the zoning districts to the map.
Okay, and then my last question for right now would be about sort of street width and how that's factoring in as we talk about parking, but also as we think about these different corridors. A corridor that is essentially 5 lanes wide because it has a chicken lane in the middle is very different than a 2-lane corridor. And we're not making very good distinctions between these as we talk about them. But it seems like there should be distinctions in the code because, when you have that shorter distance, those taller heights feel very different in terms of a planning perspective, and also the amount of people that you can get through in that corridor, even if you do have a bus going down them, is somewhat different. So I'd like to understand how that's playing into how we're thinking about it. And I appreciate the desire to prioritize the accessibility and the sidewalk with respect to the parking relaxations, but there is a difference across streets in terms of their width as well as with the sidewalks. And what we experience now in some of these neighborhoods that are off the corridors is that they tend to be much narrower than in some other places. And you have parking. Once you get parking that's on both sides, not only is there a question of accessibility on the sidewalks, but the cars can't move in both directions. And so you've reduced mobility, you've reduced the safety, in that process. And so I'm trying to understand, I don't know if there's a correlation between our high need, sidewalk plan and how that's happening and the width of streets, but I am very concerned about how that plays into the consequences of removing the parking requirements.
So that's good feedback as we continue to develop that secondary part of, first we wanted to say, okay, is disruptive, is it logical to tie those together, and then accessible route, and then we need to look at when is it appropriate to still require some parking. So we'll take the width of the street into account as we consider
And it would be
the
really
final
interesting.
recommendation. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It would be interesting to know if there's a correlation because it may be that those narrower streets don't have sidewalks either, and so you might not need to double up. I mean, the ones I'm thinking of don't have sidewalks either,
Right.
Which is part of the challenge. But there may be ones that do have it on one side or something.
Right,
like
and
that.
we do have that data at transportation, and so these are exactly why we're talking about this, to get some ideas on how we might look at that as we continue to develop those regulations, the parking regulations.
And when you do the maps, I think Anne was asking about the diagonal streets coming in. We also have some corridors that are diagonal, and I'm not being able to translate this for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Me? Oh, thank you again. These series of briefings has been very informative, and it's really encouraging to see the commitment to sticking to the council direction, but also the acknowledgments where the council direction kind of gets into trouble, And that's going to be, I think, where our remaining conversations lie, and where things comply with the direction. I know, as I've said in the last briefing, there aren't things that I agree with in the direction either, but I feel very strongly that we made our compromises, and I'm going to stick to what we approved as a body, despite whether or not I might want to go farther or less far in those areas. I love the diagrams. I find sometimes, and we talked about this last year, where we would get into a conversation with each other, and one person's thinking about one example in their district, and I'm thinking about an example in my district, and they're so different, but we're not actually talking to each other. So the diagrams are very helpful to help clarify, certainly at this stage. And I want to reiterate for the public what you said about the density bonus for these missing middle or transition zones, that it is not a height bonus. It is just a unit bonus. And I feel like there might be people who will leave that part out when they talk about it to their neighborhoods. And they will say, I mean, community engagement people will leave that part out. Folks that are advocates in one side or the other might leave that part out. That's an important key.
If I could just clarify that in the less intense transition zone, there is a 10-foot height bonus that gets you up to 45 feet. And there is no height bonus in the more intense transition zone. So you can never go over 45 feet.
So we're at 45 feet, which is still in my world a house scale type of development. I've got new homes coming up in my district in greenfield development that are 3 stories tall, and they look like the rest of the homes in my district. So that's encouraging, but it's not a 10-story, 10-unit building, which is how some folks, I fear, in the public might interpret that. And then on some of the language that I think we're using amongst ourselves, I think it's important that we not get into phrases like people taking their lot for 10 units. Nobody's lots are being taken away. I also think that there's a debate about street width and what mobility means. If it's a little more difficult for a car to get in a narrow neighborhood street, that to me is not a mobility issue. It's a little bit of a neighborhood negotiation, but mobility is a much bigger system at question. And I love the concept about tying some of these regulations, the parking regs, to the existence of ADA accessible sidewalks, which is what I hear when you say accessible. I hear ADA accessible. So this actually will require that level of sidewalk to exist in order for these parking requirements to be reduced. And I think it will create a very interesting economy and a market pressure to developers in order to help them build those sidewalks, so we're not having to do another sidewalk bond to the entire city in increasingly difficult election cycles. And the last thing, and I don't really have questions for you. I think your presentation was great, and it seemed very clear to me what we're getting to, mostly talking to my colleagues here, which is, I think, what the advantages of these meetings. I'm really excited about what I'm hearing from some of you about the areas where you're concerned, because I think I know where you're talking about in your districts. And when we get down to the map, we can get to those areas and really get to the nitpick in that one area. And if 80, 85, 90% of the city complies with a very clear policy direction, we're able to lay that out, then we can spend some productive time as a group getting into where that weird street goes in at an angle and figure out what that answer is, and getting to where some of those North University duplexes and triplexes are, and making sure that we like how those are zoned. That'll be some really great kind of get it past the goalpost work when we get to the end of the code. And I think the staff, I think y'all are doing a great job getting us through the heavy lift heading into the end of the year. So thank you.
All right, it is 10 till 5. Sorry, it's 10 till 5. We were scheduled to go till 5. I think we could probably go till 5:30, but we should probably make sure that we can start at 6 for the budget deal if people want to extend past 5.
Mayor, because this was a 2-hour work session to 5, I booked myself 5 to 6, but if a majority of folks want to stay.
I see a lot of people around the table indicating that they don't want to stay. Maybe there's a way
it's a
for
new
us
culture,
to.
guys.
Maybe there's a way for us to. Maybe there's a way for us to quickly air the questions. If we were going to do that, that means we have 10 minutes left. Ann.
Okay, I'll air questions, and
I think it'd be
then
good.
we can talk about them offline.
Yep.
Okay, So a couple of questions that I have is, it goes back to follow up with a conversation about where there's existing missing middle. And in some places, there may be existing missing middle that is already larger than the entitlement of 4 or 6. And so I want to have a conversation about what that means, because I'm concerned about the incentive to redevelop. You might have a larger complex that's over 10, and if it's rezoned, I would not want it rezoned in a way that was an incentive to build smaller numbers of units at higher prices. So I just want to have that conversation. The second thing I want to talk about is some more specifics about the definitions under K. I raised a question about orientation of blocks. There's a couple of other criteria under there that I'd like to have a conversation about exactly how that's defined, related to things like the residential blocks cited by Main Street, that one, the bound by other zones, use, or environmental features. So I just want to understand the definitions of those. And then I also want to understand, I think, Mayor, you had raised this perhaps at a previous work session about the process. There's questions about the process for establishing the transition zones and applying context sensitivity to them. And there's a related question about the process for the neighborhood conversations. So I think we had, if I'm remembering correctly, we'd raised the question about the process for the neighborhood conversations earlier, and I'm not sure if y'all have had a chance yet to lay that out. I am hopeful that, particularly in areas that involve application of context sensitivity, that there's an opportunity for neighborhoods to have that conversation with you all before you release the map. I just think that that could just make sure that you have on the ground kinds of information that way. So, but I just need to understand what that is. So, in terms of when those, I mean, I know you're talking to people now, and that's great. But I'm talking about when you get to the point where there's something specific. Councilmember Garza had asked if there was a map of the transition zones yet, and I understand there isn't yet. But it would be good, I would just like to suggest that there be opportunities to talk at that level of specificity, particularly about how you're applying context sensitivity before you get to your final release in October. Let's see, so I think the last one I think is just a real quick question. When we're talking about the parking requirements, we're talking about the area that's a quarter mile in, right? I mean, we're not talking about parking in the middle of neighborhoods. Am I understanding correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. Let's see. I may have others, but I think that's. Well, I'll also want to understand better how the 850 feet was arrived at. But we can talk about that offline. Y'all have talked about that, but I just want to understand. I have some more questions about that.
Kathy?
A couple of these may be super quick. And Mayor, I was shaking my head that I can't stay till 5:30, but I can stay a little bit if people want to stay for a little bit.
Right now, I think people kind of felt that way, so kind of highlight the question,
Sure.
even if we don't have a chance to really discuss them.
So the downtown density bonus program, the staff had recommended, our housing staff have recommended that we make an amendment to it because at the moment we're disincentivizing commercial projects. And so it was my understanding that amendment was coming forward. I am hoping that we can do that non-residential development change in advance of this process. And so that was the substance of my question. I'd like to see that change happen very soon. I think it's really critical that we do. It is, we're leaving, I think we want those other projects to come into the downtown density bonus program, and especially because that money is now earmarked because of a change that our council has made. It's not just earmarked for housing, permanent supportive housing, it's also earmarked for services for permanent supportive housing, both of which are really critical needs. I would like to know which sub-districts within the downtown density bonus program are being proposed for changes. I am interested at a future work session in having a discussion about areas of the city that are subject to deed restrictions that might change what can happen in transition zones. In some of these hearings, sometimes people say there are areas in the northern and other parts of our city where there are deed restrictions that prevent the addition of a house of another structure, and whether there's work going on in those communities to make changes to those deed restrictions. I did read the post, and I appreciate you continuing to use the blog to address kind of issues of current concern. I did read the post about what happens in the transition zone with regard to, I'm not going to get the phrase, conforming uses, non-conforming uses, et cetera. But it still didn't answer for me the question of what happens for that property that may just be a single structure now. They have the ability to do an ADU, but they haven't yet. If they're in the transition zone, do they have an ability to do an ADU in the future, or can they only make changes to that tract if they're adding 3 units? And so I think that's, while the post did speak to a property owner's ability to rebuild if they haven't taken it down, if they haven't demolished the site, to do limited renovations, it's still not clear to me sort of what the scale of those renovations would be and whether they have an opportunity to add an accessory dwelling unit or something less than the number of 4. And then my last question or comment, question/comment, when you're looking at the correlation, not the correlation thing, it's been a very long day, calculating the density bonus provisions. I hope that as you're looking in the transition zone that we're not just making that based on what it would take to get from 4 to 8, but what are the current conditions on that tract presently. So if we have a tract that is presently, that has the ability to do 2 units and they're being rezoned in the less intense, I think their affordability component should be calculated based on current conditions, not on the entitlements they'll get if this zoning change goes through. Does that make sense? The calibration, thank you. I think the calibration should be based on, the calibration for the affordable housing element should be based on current conditions, not conditions post rezoning. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, Alice and then Greg.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do have one last question, and if you can answer this before we leave, that would be super helpful. Because I have multiple neighborhoods that do fall into this category where they are, in some cases, 850 from one quarter and 850 from another, and you will certainly have, if all of that is mapped, you would encompass not just most of the neighborhood, but the entire neighborhood. I think what I heard you say in answer to my question, Mayor Pro Tem Garza's and maybe others, is that at this point, you are doing those on a manual basis, but there's not an across-the-board calculation for how that gets dialed back. You are dialing it back, but there's nothing I can't say to them, you're dialing it back to 2 or you're dialing it back to 1 lot. There's just, at this point, what it would be accurate in saying is if you're between South Congress and South First, there will be a dialing back.
Right.
There's no certainty about how.
There's no calculation. It's planning judgment at this point, and it's manual. And we are trying our hardest to consider housing capacity per council direction with regards to not encompassing the entire neighborhood. But we don't have any numbers with it right now. It's planning judgment at this point. We'll consider in the future coming back once the map develops with a different way to describe that.
Yeah, that's not going to impact everybody's district because some have very long
Sure.
street. In the central city where you have, it's built out to have small blocks, you're going to have that in many, many cases, and it's an area of large concern right now.
And I wanted to clarify too the about 800 feet, 850. That's the maximum, but as we're developing the transition zone, it's more in the range of 500 to 700 is really what we're looking at. The max is around 850, but that's not the most common. So I just wanted to, as those numbers are being discussed, I wanted to clarify that because it seems like we keep talking about the 850, but that really is not the norm. The norm is more in the 500 to 700, and it's measured from the front of the corridor lot, and that's really important, I think, for the public to understand, not from the back of the corridor lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So thank you. At a future work session, I would like to know more about what is planned with respect to the parkland dedication approach. We have very strong statements in Imagine Austin about the importance of our parks. And we have a lot of history in our parkland dedication ordinance that ought to be considered, and those facts should be considered in creating it, rather than assumptions being made about that. I would also like to see some explanation of when you have a commercial zoning, one lot in, but then you go into residential, as to what happens with how we're thinking about the transition zones. So I have some of those areas in my district. And then I just want to reiterate what I asked for before in terms of understanding the corridor and those entitlements. I'm very concerned about the approach where we're giving a lot of entitlements and assuming that we're going to be able to get this affordability through these bonuses, and that we have undermined our ability to get the affordable units, which are a type of supply that we really want to get. And we need to think long and hard about whether just the base zoning that we're giving is undermining our ability to deliver on those affordable units. And we need to not just be asking that with respect to the transition zone, but also with respect to the corridors and near the activity centers, because we have a base entitlement now and we will be going up. And the more we give them just as base entitlement, the less there is an incentive to build the affordable. And those are intertwined as somebody approaches their development. And lastly, I want to just follow up on Paige's comment with respect to the activity centers. I appreciate you focusing on what you were going to do with respect to the downtown Austin plan, but one of the things that we put into the direction was also the desire to do the same thing in your other activity centers. And I'd like to hear more about how we're going to be getting the density in those places as well.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to mention one thing with regards to the transition zones and seeing maps. Y'all should be getting requests for to come at the end of September, where we're going to set up in executive session or somewhere in City Hall and allow you all 75 minutes to come look at the transition areas in your area and give us feedback prior to the release. So I didn't make that clear earlier in the scheduling, but that is part of our process with you all. And then we will have those one-on-ones and the open houses for neighborhood thought leaders and residents to come give us feedback in October, leading up to the supplemental. We anticipate we will hear things through one-on-ones. We will hear things through the open houses from neighborhood leaders and residents that will, similar to the ASMP process, where we can say what those are, whether we agree, disagree, and issue that supplemental staff recommendation to the Planning Commission. So again, end of September, we'll be able to go over the transition zones specific to your districts with you all, and then have the ability to take further impact and input in October, and perhaps make changes to our staff recommendation if appropriate.
Very good, thank you. Greg?
This was just actually to clear up one question. I think, as long as you follow the direction that Councilmember Alter brought, that you said you might bring back an answer to later, but I think maybe we can clear it up now. I was having flashbacks to us passing the direction and found it. Councilmember Alter raised the question of transition areas that are not that are residential transit priority network streets, that are not commercial corridor type streets. And what we said was that if the transition area is not on an Imagine Austin corridor, but is actually on a residential transit priority network street, that the street facing lot should begin with missing middle zoning rather than corridor zoning. So I would anticipate then that what you bring back would be where it says corridor, if it was a residential transit priority network street, that there would be one of those two versions of orange facing it. Is that generally what we should
That's
expect?
correct.
I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I have some of those.
I would prefer that than the opportunity that it could be anything that's defined as missing middle, which has no definition.
I think there's definitions missing middle, but we don't have to have that work session again.
All right.
And then I think the issue that we are facing on calibration, I think that from the document we really tried to prioritize missing middle being a good thing that we want to get, and low income affordable restricted housing as a good thing, and that we want to get both of those things. So I would really want our calibration to get us low-income units when we can get them, and it seems like we can get more of them from the corridor lots more than some of the inside the neighborhood lots, just based on the economics. But to me, we have a low-income housing crisis, the housing bond, a lot of those funding mechanisms are key ways to address that. But then we also want middle-class and family-sized units, and so I really want to see the missing middle thing happen, and we need to see both happen. So however you calibrate it, I remain in favor of still trying to get both of those things and recognizing that I may not get both of those things on every lot, but that I just want to get more of each of those things wherever we can in the city. So I know some folks, we will leave it to the economists and calibrators to give us the best options, but I'm going to be looking to getting both things, but not always both things on the same lot.
And 1 in 10 seconds.
5. Okay, the zoning categories, my confusion, are they set yet, or are y'all coming out with additional or new zoning? So in other words, do we look to draft 3, or are there going to be new zoning categories?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
I'm wanting to know if we have all the existing zoning categories, and do we look to draft 3, or are you going to be coming out with new zoning categories?
So draft 3 is a good place to start. We're anticipating that the zones will change a bit
Okay.
in name and in standards.
When will we see those?
At a future work session, possibly. It's a work in progress right now.
Okay, I guess a better question is, to my mind, when we're thinking about transition zones, if we don't know what the zoning categories are, it makes it harder to think about the application of a transition zone.
For the transition zones, I think for sure we can give you some additional details
Okay.
at some point.
Before we look at the maps.
I think that would.
Okay, the sooner we
work.
have that, the more helpful it'll be to our thinking about it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I think those are all the things that we have. It does look like there's a lot of calibration going on. I just raised that so that we have calibration expertise, and I would remind everybody that we may be setting a council meeting tentatively for December 12th. We have one right on the 5th, but if we need the 12th in order to be able to consider this in December, we may do that, so everybody should be looking at that and keeping that date open on their calendar. That said, it is 5:08, and this special session of council is going to be adjourned. We will start a new council meeting at 6 o'clock in City Council chambers, and we have like 130 people that are signed up at this point. So it'll be a good time to hear from the community. I'll see you guys there. We will start at 6 o'clock sharp if we have folks there.